Welcome and thanks for joining us for Two Steps Forward, our daily Bible study. I'm James. This is my wife, Aid. We are midway through the book of John, John's Gospel, and John's Gospel moves to the Holy Week events faster than any of the rest of the Gospels. So by the time you get to mid-week, mid-Gospel, around John 13, you're already near there's a large percentage of it that actually covers the Holy Week events. And so we're almost there already. We're on John chapter 11 today, episode 376. John chapter 11 is famous for the resurrection of Lazarus. So that's what we are going to cover today. Anything before we get started?
You should show people your phone.
My phone, okay. This is the full size of the phone. So I'm recording on my iPhone. But I've recently purchased something called a light phone. And this is basically due to a couple of different factors. There's a number of people in our congregation who have actually moved to something like this. You can call it a dumb phone if you want, but it doesn't do all the things that a smartphone does intentionally. And the idea of it is if you look at, for instance, your usage report on your iPhone and it tells you you're using it 6-8 hours a day, which is not uncommon for a lot of people. How much do you really want to be doing? That's just your phone. That doesn't include your laptop or your TV or how much screen time do you want in a given day? And actually, one of the things I've told people before is if you can't do meditation for 2 minutes thinking on your breathing without your mind drifting, it generally means your brain is overstimulated. I've gotten to the point where I realize I'm constantly on my phone. The moment you leave a room, I'm on my phone.
Doing what?
Sports scores, work, emails. So what this phone doesn't allow you to do basically is a lot of apps and internet browsing. What it does allow is calls, texts, navigation, and even podcasts, which is helpful for me because I listen to a ton of podcasts. But I've said this many times now. I think we've gotten to a point where, from a technological standpoint, we used to pay to get technology. Now we're paying to get away from technology to become more human. And so that's where I'm at right now.
It is really interesting, though. We went out to dinner Friday, and you went to the bathroom, and my back was hurting, so I was just too lazy to try to dig my phone on my purse. I have up a pulled muscle.
Yeah.
And so I just sat there waiting for you, and I thought, I must look like such an idiot right now. People are like, what is she doing? Just staring.
It's fascinating how to look at other people now. You notice things. So one thing I noticed about myself is I very clearly was going through some form of withdrawals in the first 48 hours where I felt like I couldn't have access to something that I really wanted access to. And it made me anxious, made me kind of nervous and that sort of thing. But then you also notice more when you're not looking at your phone how everybody else is looking at their phone. And I did a wedding yesterday out of about an hour away from where we live. And one of the things I mentioned to Aid is when I'm driving now, I can see, I would guess half the people who are on the road are at the very least glancing at their phones frequently. That's not a lie. Not just at stop signs, but throughout. Watch other people while they're driving. Maybe not half the time, but half, I would say, are at least glancing.
So even I don't do this.
Yeah.
I do not look at my phone.
When you say even you're saying you are the embodiment of a reckless driver.
Well, I'm not a great driver. I'm a fine driver. But I don't look at my phone. But I have found, with my watch, if I'm listening to a podcast, I can easily have my hand on the steering wheel and I can hit skip or ahead. I could probably even read a text message on it, but I don't know. I feel like it's especially with so much construction and on the freeway, if you look for away for 1 second, that person in front of you could stop. Maybe I just drive too close to people. That's all it would take though for.
It's driving is one of those things I think that 20 years from now, no one's actually going to be driving their own car. But the fact that Apple has put reports on your phone that they are saying to you, you're probably using your phone too much. The people who are at the very top of People who are at the very forefront of AI research right now, the major companies are telling the government, you need to start regulating AI before this sort of gets out of control. And so, I think we're going to see the pendulum shift, and I just personally needed to start detaching a little bit from that sort of stuff. So, Light Phone 2 is what it's called. It's enormously frustrating. I will immediately say that. Like, you won't like it at first, but the question isn't whether or not you like it. The question whether or not it's necessary in your life. So, all right, so here we are in John chapter 11, the death and resurrection of Lazarus. If you haven't read it yet, please make sure to do so. Here's my personal summary. Lazarus is, again, this is the brother of the sisters Mary and Martha, whom we encounter a couple different times in the Gospels. They live in Bethany, and he becomes deathly sick. Seems to be like the family outside of his own that Jesus, maybe even more than his own, that Jesus is closest to. The sisters sent word to Jesus saying, "The Lord, the one that you love, is sick." Jesus heard this and said, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." And then we're told that because Jesus loved this family, he stayed where he was for 2 more days. That's an interesting kind of turn of phrase. It's because he loved them that he waited where he was. Then he told his disciples that they were going back to Judea. And the disciples argued with Jesus that not long ago the Jews tried to stone Jesus in Judea, but Jesus answered that they would be okay. Jesus then said that he was going to wake up Lazarus, referring to bringing him back to life, but the disciples didn't know what he was talking about. Jesus told them that Lazarus was dead, so he's very clearly aware of this. Thomas spoke up and said to the disciples that they should go to Bethany, even if that means dying with Jesus in Judea.
Also, I feel like people only remember Thomas for his doubting, but what about this statement?
Yes, it's a statement of loyalty at the very least.
And faith and loyalty.
Yeah, yep. Yeah, Thomas, he gets kind of a bad rap for the doubting label, but I don't think, frankly, that's only if you see doubting as a negative. In some respects, doubting is actually sort of a wise and cynical, it can be a positive. But yes, here's a famous statement of Thomas for his loyalty. When Jesus and the disciples got there to Bethany, Lazarus had already been dead and in the tomb for 4 days. And the way that, again, the Jews counted this, it was day 1 is the day you're on, day 2 is the next day, and so forth. And so every time they say a day number, it's one more than how we would count things. So when circumcision happens on the 8th day, that means a week from the day you're born. Anyways, so 4 days. So died on 1 day, 1, 2, 3. This is the 3rd day after that. Many Jews were there mourning with the family, and Martha went out to meet Jesus when she heard that he'd arrived. She said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." And Jesus replied, "Your brother will rise again." Martha acknowledged that she knew about the resurrection on the last day, which Jews all had a understanding of. But Jesus replied that he is the resurrection and the life, and anyone who believes in him will live even though they die and never really die. He asked her if she believed, and Martha replied that she did. Martha then went and got Mary, and Mary quickly went out to meet Jesus. She said the same thing that Martha did. Literally, it's recorded the exact same words. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Jesus saw her and the other Jews weeping, and were told that he's deeply moved in spirit and troubled. And he asked where Lazarus' body had been buried. They told Jesus to follow them, and this is where we get that famous verse, Jesus wept. The Jews were torn between recognizing how much Jesus loved Lazarus, but also sort of wondering, why didn't he just come earlier to help him? We knew that he's capable of that. Jesus arrived at the tomb and told the people to roll the stone away. Martha interrupted and said how much the body would stink after 4 days. Martha's always very much a pragmatist and cleaning stuff up, and she's like, no, this body will stink. Jesus told her to believe and she would see God's glory. They took the stone away. Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I'm saying this for the benefit of the people here." And then Jesus shouted, "Lazarus, come out." Lazarus came out wrapped in linen cloths, and Jesus told the people to remove his grave clothes. Many of the Jews then came to believe in Jesus, and some of the Jews went and told the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin. At this point, they called a meeting. The Jewish leaders said that if we let Jesus go on like this, more and more people are just going to come to believe in him. And then when more people believe in him, the Romans are going to take away our temple and subdue our nation. The high priest Caiaphas spoke up and he said that it was better for one man to die than for the whole nation to perish. And Caiaphas, the high priest, it was sort of unknowingly prophesying what Jesus literally did come to do, one man to die so that the whole nation doesn't perish. And from then on, they plotted to kill Jesus. Jesus would no longer travel in public in Judea. He withdrew to a village called Ephraim with his disciples. It's getting close to the Passover festival, and everyone there was asking about Jesus. But the Jewish leaders had given orders that anyone who found him should notify them so that they could arrest him. And that's John chapter 11. Mm-hmm. Devotional thought number 1. The timeline of God. So just so we're all on the same page as far as what the day, like the timeline of Lazarus passing is, because it's very calculated on Jesus' part here. He's doing something very specific. Day 1, the messenger comes to get Jesus because Lazarus is very deathly ill. Day 2, the messenger is returning to Bethany. Jesus says that he is only asleep, but Lazarus physically actually dies on that day, day 2. Day 3, Jesus says, we're going to wait. He waits another day. And then finally on day 4, Jesus and the disciples arrive at Bethany. So one of the reasons for this is the Jewish culture had developed a myth by this point that the spirit remained around a dead body for around 4 days, the way that they counted the days. And Jesus is making certain that everybody understands that Lazarus, from a physical standpoint, from their perspective, is fully dead, and therefore that when he raises him from every angle, this is totally a miracle. You know, like it's not like his spirit was nearby and Jesus then somehow reanimated him. No, he's totally, from the Jewish perspective, he's totally dead. And this group, the disciples and these sisters, when they're examining Jesus' actions, interestingly, they are inclined to basically question Jesus' wisdom and his love. And you can see they're trying to do it without complaining, but they're definitely questioning what Jesus was doing. And they're kind of questioning, like, this is the guy that you love. Why didn't you come earlier? The text makes it very clear that Jesus does love Lazarus, but he's nonetheless not doing what they want him to do. So another interesting element of this is they're already familiar with the idea that Jesus has remotely healed people. So, for instance, in John chapter 4, we saw Jesus healing an official's son in Capernaum who was a distance away. And he said, why don't you come and heal my son? And Jesus tells the man to go away. And we're told at that moment, Jesus healed the guy's son. Mm-hmm. So he's capable of healing from a distance. The disciples all know this. So why doesn't he do it here? In the lack of urgency for him to do what they want him to do, when they want him to do it, is very perplexing to God's people. When we say, okay, God, we know you love us, we know you're powerful, why won't you do what we want you to do when we want you to do it? Again, if he did that, then he wouldn't be God. He would just be our powerful servant. And what we need to, one of the ways I've heard somebody put this, which I thought was helpful, is God's love is not a pampering love, it's a perfecting love. He doesn't just treat us like babies that we can stay babies and cry and then he feeds us or changes us. He meets us where we're at and he tries to turn us into more mature individuals and adult Christians. And the aim of his love is not simply to make us more comfortable. The aim of his love is to make us the best version of ourselves. And what that means then is he operates differently from what we would expect, what we would choose, and the end result is that it would glorify God and that it would build God's people up. So my question for you here is, without thinking of like naming names or specific circumstances, can you think of a circumstance where where you were inclined to question God's timing or operation, either for yourself or maybe for someone else, but maybe especially if at a later point it's like, oh, that's why God did that. That's why God allowed that.
Yes, but you obviously don't want me to expound upon that.
I don't mind if you expound on it. I just want you to sometimes leaving proper nouns out of the specifics in terms of names.
Names of places or people?
Either one. You can tell stories without including that information.
Okay, I think for me personally, and this is separate from like, I guess your ministry, but like when you got your assignment out of the seminary to Minnesota, and I just kind of felt like this is not a place I want to be. I'm not going to fit in Minnesota. I never wanted to live in Minnesota.
Sure.
And I think we were kind of questioning like why this shook out this way. And this is not the first story that I've heard from called workers who get assignments and have said the same thing. Like, this is definitely not what I expected to happen.
Yeah.
And so maybe it's more of a circumstance of God works it out for your good. But we had a lot of great friends there. But for me, one of my roommates from college actually lived in Rochester. She worked at Mayo Clinic. And so when we went there, her and I spent more time together. So I had like a built-in friend there already who was very supportive, but she's the one who convinced me to become a nurse. And if we hadn't lived where Mayo is, I don't know that I ever would have considered that.
Yeah.
So that was beneficial to me. And then kind of the same thing, like we definitely wanted to come to Milwaukee, but for me, I was like, I worked really hard to become a nurse, and I want to be a nurse anesthetist, and if I leave Mayo, my chance of that decreases dramatically.
Yeah.
There were no programs here at the time. There was a program in Chicago a lot of people went to, but I was like, I don't think it's good for my marriage or your ministry if I'm like traveling all the time, gone all the time. So I felt like I kind of put that dream aside, and then like a program opened here, and it was a great program for me. It was local.
Yep.
Like everything worked out really well. So again, I don't know if it's just like, this is a yes for you, but not right now, and just trust my timing, or if it's a more like, nope, this is where I've called you to be for other reasons, but I'm going to work it out in these ways for you. Yeah.
Yes, I feel like both you and I went through similar experiences with that whole situation. And I mean, I had have a brother who's a pastor, a brother-in-law who was a pastor. Both of them got assigned out of the seminary to sort of mission locations outside of the Midwest, like small startup congregations. And it seemed like what I was, one, interested in doing, two, what I was kind of like, I felt gifted and wired to do. So to land in a congregation in the Midwest where I was one of three pastors, and it didn't add up to me. For me, that created a little bit more time that I was available to do different things. I got into like some online ministry stuff and blogging and stuff like that, which is ultimately what probably created some connections that I eventually was called to the congregation that we're currently at, and which seems like a really good fit in a variety of different ways. So it really is in the heat of the moment or in the storm of what you feel God should be doing. Like you really have to continue to. It's like judging a book on the third chapter. Like, to some extent, you can't fully make an analysis until you read the last chapter.
Yeah, and even like when we were in Rochester, I remember getting maybe like 4 years in, you got a call to California. And I think I had like one semester of nursing school left or something. And it's virtually impossible. This is so silly, but like state to state to transfer nursing programs. Yeah. And we were like, this just doesn't make, like, timing is not right. And I feel like we were both kind of disappointed in that. Yeah, because we like the idea of the opportunity and location and but I still think St. Marcus is probably a better fit than that even would have been for us. Yeah. Yep. There's a level of trying to do the right thing and trusting that all the other circumstantial stuff God works out. But you very much feel like the way Mary and Martha are talking here, like, Lord, why aren't you doing, like, I want to be respectful, I want to trust you, but this doesn't seem quite right to me, and I'm in a little bit of discomfort as a result of it, Okay, so first point is the timeline of God. Second devotional thought today then is ministering to us personally. This is the first time this was ever explained to me, I thought, wow, this is extraordinarily insightful in terms of how God ministers and really how we should minister to one another.
But you have two sisters, Mary and Martha. They're in the exact same circumstance. They both lost their brother. They literally both say the exact same words. They're recorded as saying the same statement. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. So they're going through the same trauma. They say the same thing, but they're different people and have different personalities. And we know this throughout the rest of the Gospels. Martha is kind of this pragmatist. She's the one that, by the way, that other story where Mary sits at Jesus' feet and Martha is busy working to prepare the house for everyone. Martha is the one that is like totally gets things done. Like she's a go-getter, she's a doer, she's a pragmatist, she's responsible, and to Martha, when she says, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died, what Jesus does is he gives her some theology. He talks about the resurrection of the dead. Mary has said the exact same thing, but Mary's a different type of personality. She's sort of this big-hearted romantic. And what Jesus does here, when she says, Lord, if you had been here, he wouldn't have died, what Jesus does is he weeps with her. So two sisters, same circumstances, say the exact same thing. Jesus ministers to each of them very personally, very differently, because he knows us each individually. Ministry, therefore, one of the lessons we learned from this, ministry is not simply a matter of declaring or teaching God's word to God's people. It is that, but that's not a sufficient explanation. Rather, what ministry is there's a humanity attached to it by which you know people well enough and you love them enough that you give them what they need personally based on their circumstances, based on who they are as a person. This is in Lutheran terms, Luther referred to this as the proper application of law and gospel. Two kids who commit the same error, the same mistake, the same defiance, one of them might be so crippled with guilt that they come to you crying, and the other one is like, what are you going to do about it? You know, you have to deal with those kids differently if you're going to lovingly parent them. You can't just dehumanize and say like, well, every human's basically the same in that respect. No, you have to, ministry is always a personal application of truth from God, and that's exactly what Jesus is doing right here with these two sisters. Have you seen ways in which God probably gave you what you needed when you needed it as a sort of personal ministry to you? Anything that comes to mind?
Well, the first thing I thought is, I think he gave you to me when I needed it. So, I mean, I was very young when we met, and when I've said this before, like I never thought I would get married. It's not that I thought I wouldn't get married, I just didn't think about it. You know how like I feel like young women at some point have visualized that or whatever.
You're thinking more about career or whatever else.
Yeah, but I definitely feel like I think my faith could have gone a very different way if I didn't like have you in my life. So I think you were probably a personal ministry to me.
I think, obviously the same in many ways. One of the things I always think of for me is, obviously I've talked about mental health stuff and getting depression when I was about 18 years old, because I very much, ministry was not on my radar. Christianity was very veneer for me at that point, very superficial. And had I gone to a like public university or something like that, which would have appealed to me in many ways, I can very easily see myself sort of going off Christian rails at that point. I'm not saying that's the case for every college student. I'm saying where I was at and where my value system was at. So that God allowed me a depression by which I questioned everything, including my faith, including what the meaning of my life was and stuff like that, and then landed at a Christian college. Seems like personal ministry. I think, yes, one another as spouses. I think friends, like the idea that God has given us people that we needed when we needed them, has always been a kind of a fascinating thing to me. Like God doesn't just randomly have people cross paths, but he gives us personally, relationally what we need when we need it.
Well, and I always feel guilty for not like keeping in contact with friends, but I think the way you just said it, like different people come into your lives for different purposes. Like I don't think you necessarily have to feel guilty about
Yes, there is a level of. So there's a level of like.
And I'm talking about like moving away. I'm not talking about like I just stopped talking to.
Right. Yeah.
Someone who lives next door to me. You know.
Well, and it's also not like this volitional cutting ties off
Right,
thing.
yeah.
It's more of just the practicality of day-to-day ministry. If you're thousands of miles away from somebody, it's hard to minister to them day to day. But the people that you cross paths with regularly, God coordinates. Devotional thought number 3. I've used this. This is one of those devotional thoughts that I probably used before, but it's such a recurring theme in Scripture that it needs to be said again. Is the devotional thought 3 is the idol of religion, and it's just a fascinating, like, hardened reaction that the news of Lazarus' resurrection understandably spreads throughout Judea. Like, okay, we literally saw this guy. We were all at this guy's funeral for 4 days, half a week, weeping for him, tons of people. And then we all saw him rise from the grave by Jesus commanding him to. And word spreads. The Pharisees and the Sanhedrin meet. The high priest Caiaphas, he argues, look, if we allow Jesus to continue to heal people and do these things, the whole nation is going to follow him. That's their argument. And the cause and effect is like, if this, then this. And the then is the Romans, who have allowed us our Jewish religion, have allowed us our temple, have allowed us to exist as a nation within the Roman Empire. They're going to see this new rising faith in Jesus as he's our new king. And the Romans are going to be threatened by that. The Romans are going to take away our temple. The Romans are going to subdue us as a nation. And so therefore, in order to save the nation, we have to sacrifice this one miracle worker. And what Caiaphas doesn't realize is he's prophetically doing the exact thing that the Bible prophesies that the Messiah would do, and that Jesus said that he would be. That one person would die on behalf of an entire people group. And I mean, from it, obviously that doesn't justify, even though God brings good from it, that doesn't justify Caiaphas's or the Sanhedrin's actions. And what are they doing? They can literally watch a miracle worker who's bringing dead people back to life and healing so many blind and sick and lame and all that, and they can say, no, we need to stop this. And the idea is religious people, when they get more concerned about self-preservation, when they get more concerned about their own power, their own survival, their own prominence and prestige, their own status, their buildings, their traditions, and so on and so forth. When religious people care more about that stuff than about loving God above all and loving their neighbor as their self, they stop serving the living God. They start essentially just serving their own man-made religion. Okay. Does this teach us anything about how highly religious people may respond, not will respond or always respond, but may respond to genuine Christianity?
I think then they would get offended by it, right?
Yeah, I think so. We're in the middle of wedding season right now. Weddings, so preaching on the weekend to my congregation is one thing. Preaching at weddings is an entirely different animal because I have no idea what backgrounds people are coming from, and it's usually a mixed gathering, and a portion of the group does the sign of the cross whenever I use the Trinitarian for it. It's like every wedding I do. But when I give a message, and I tell the couple this ahead of time, I'm like, don't ask me to do at a wedding unless you want a demonstrably Christian sermon like this. I'm not just going to get up there and tell nice stories about you as a couple. That's what everybody does at the reception. That's not what I'm doing. If you want me as a Christian pastor to do it, I'm going to give you a Christian sermon that does apply specifically to you as a couple. And therefore, I think I catch some people off guard when I go as intensely as I do into sermons at weddings. And I can tell because people can't, for whatever reason, in part because we're so used to screens, people don't realize that when I'm preaching, I can see their facial expressions. I can see how they're reacting to everything, and I don't think they realize that. And I would characterize the reactions I get for sermons at weddings in terms of sometimes it's confusion, sometimes it's anger, and sometimes it's a affirmation of this is distinctly Christian and whatever.
You're saying that you're heavy on the law?
not just heavy on the law, but it's way more intense as an evangelistic message.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I feel like every wedding you do, you should be preaching to like come to the altar.
Sermon. It's the only time a lot of people will still step foot in sanctuaries. And the thing is, I'm never going to see a lot of these people again. So I frankly don't care that much if, like, some people are angry. Some people, a portion are apathetic. Some people, again, they look kind of confused or shocked. And then some people are just very affirming of it. I'm way more concerned about the percentage of people who are like, oh, yes, that's right. Which might be, maybe 15, 20%. But like the people who were already apathetic and were already angry about faith, they weren't going to come back anyways. So like, I don't care if they don't like it. What I'm more interested in the people who have not yet come to any convictions. They're not hardened in that respect. And I know full well, by the way, a lot of those people who look a little at times almost even upset, they would self-identify as Christian, but they're hardened in some respects. They just don't care. They don't really want to hear it. They want to get done with a service. They want to check it off. You can tell this is just work for them. They can tell they're not worshiping. I can see it to the degree I can't see in their hearts, but to the degree that I can see their general posture, you can sort of tell. And I think, it's like, where do the Pharisees hang out? They hang out at synagogues. They hang out at churches. The pagans, the prostitutes, the tax collectors, generally speaking, they hang out in the culture and in the market and in the whatever. But the most Pharisaical people tend to like to hang around churches. And so you have to be very firm with them on what the gospel is and not let them try to bully their religious ways upon the rest of spiritually minded people. All right? Anything else on John 11? All right. Father, thanks for our time in your word here today. Thank you for not only the death and resurrection of your own son, but the resurrection of Lazarus proves some interesting things to us. That proves that, Jesus, you're not only capable of raising yourself, but that you'll raise us too. That you love us, that you nonetheless don't always do things on the timeline that we would probably prefer and ask you to, but that's because your ways are higher than our ways, and you love us more than we could even love ourselves. So help us to humbly, faithfully submit to your will, and we look forward to our resurrections. In your name we pray. Amen. Thanks for studying with us today. We'll see you tomorrow for John chapter 12.